Hello, 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 everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar, which means that I have been studying the works of J.R.R. Tolkien for many decades, ever since I was basically a young boy and I first discovered The Hobbit. I was around 7, 8 years old. The Lord of the Rings, I was around 10, 11, somewhere around there. The Silmarillion a bit later, and so on and so on and so on. Unfinished Tales, actually, before the Silmarillion. But I'm generally the guy that you can come to ask any sort of question about The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, or any of J.R.R. Tolkien's works, or even stuff about Tolkien himself. And if you want to ask me a question, you can go ahead and do so right in the comments. Or if you want to be featured in a video, you can do so through Quora. Quora is very easy to use, very simple to set up. All you have to do is go there and make an account, which you can do using your Facebook account or your Google account. So it's pretty much just one click, and then just ask a question. And there's a link to my Quora in the description where you can specifically ask me a question. But if you're on that website and you ask any sort of question related to Tolkien, once you're finished asking it and submitting it, it's going to give you a list of people that you should tag in it, and my name is going to be at or near the top of that list. So you could totally just do it that way as well. Sometimes people just don't want to go through Quora. That's perfectly fine. That is where I pull the questions for videos, but any question in the comments I try to get to as much as I can. To address the fact that I didn't do an episode last week, I put up a different sort of video where I was the first part of a reaction and analysis of the Rankin Bass Hobbit cartoon. Normally I would have done an episode and then put that video up at a different time, like on a weekend or something, but I really wasn't feeling well is what it comes down to. I do suffer from migraines chronically, and I had probably the worst migraine of my life that started the Sunday before last and then went straight through to about 3 days ago. So yeah, it was really like very nearly 2 weeks worth of just pure headaches. And so during that time I was either just in an unreasonable amount of pain or medicated. And that Tuesday night, I record these on Tuesday nights, I was planning on doing it anyway, just powering through it, but then I just couldn't do it. I needed to rest. So I said, hey, I have a video in the pipeline there. We'll put that up in lieu of a regular episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. There will be more of those as well. And we will return to the Hobbit video game playthrough as well. I haven't forgotten about that. I've just been busy, and then when I'm not busy, I'm suffering from migraines and such. Quick channel update. We're up to, I think, 1,815 subscribers. Let me check it real quick. That's not the right screen to be on. Ah, exactly right. 1,815 subscribers as of me recording this. When I edit it, it might be a different number. When I upload it, it might be a different number, and such and such and such. When it goes live to the majority of people, it will certainly be a different number, because I put out the videos for members only for about a week before they go out to everybody. So, hey, consider membership if you want to see the videos early. For right now, I'm just going to ask subscribe if you like the content, but I'm going to ask you again at the end. If you make it to the end of the video, then certainly if you're not subscribed, you'll probably want to do so at that point, because it means you've watched, about an hour or so of me talking about Tolkien. If you can get through that much of it, you should probably subscribe. Speaking of which, we do have a lot of questions to get through. I had to be very selective because I'm doing 2 weeks worth of questions. Although I didn't write as much or answer as many questions as I normally would because of the headache, I still was. So I had to be rather selective. We have 20 questions to get through. But first, of course, we have a reading. And I just realized that I don't have any of the books with me. I had they're normally right next to me, like here, but I moved them because I had a cable guy come in here to look at my internet yesterday, and he fixed that. I didn't move the books back, so I'm going to use a digital version, which I guess you guys don't mind that, because I did do that for Lost Tales at one point. But what are we going to read? Let's see, what do I have here? I think I'll just pick a part of the Silmarillion. All right, I think I'll just pick a part of the Silmarillion. Let's see. I could give you a little bit of a Beren and Luthien. I think that's what we're going to do. I want to get the part where, because we're going to talk about this later, in one of the questions where they actually get the Silmaril. So let's do that. Okay, here we are. This is the part I'm going to read. They passed through all perils, until they came, with the dust of their long and weary road upon them, to the drear dale that lay before the gate of Angband. Black chasms opened beside the road, whence forms as of writhing serpents issued. On either hand the cliffs stood on embattled walls, and upon them sat carrion fowl, crying with fell voices. Before them was the impregnable gate, an arch wide and dark as the foot in the mountain, where it reared 1,000 feet of precipice. There dismay took them, for at the gate was a guard of whom no tidings had yet gone forth. Rumour of he knew not what designs abroad among the princes of the elves had come to Morgoth. And ever down the aisles of the forest was heard the baying of Huan, the great hound of war, whom long ago the Valar unleashed. Then Morgoth recalled the doom of Huan, and he chose one from among the whelps of the race of Dragluin, and he fed him with his own hand upon living flesh, and put his power upon him. Swiftly the wolf grew, until he could creep into no den, but lay huge and hungry before the feet of Morgoth. There the fire and anguish of hell entered into him, and he became filled with a devouring spirit, tormented, terrible, and strong. Cacharoth, the red maw he is named in the tales of those days, and Anfagliur, the jaws of thirst. And Morgoth set him to lie unsleeping before the doors of Angband, lest Huan came. Now Cacharoth espied them from afar, and he was filled with doubt, for news had long been brought to Angband that Draugluin was dead. Therefore when they approached he denied them entry, and bade them stand, and he drew near with menace, scenting something strange in the air about him. But suddenly some power, descended from of old from divine race, possessed Luthien, and casting back her foul raiment she stood forth, small before the might of Cacharoth, but radiant and terrible. Lifting up her hand, she commanded him to sleep, saying, O woe-begotten spirit, fall now into dark oblivion, and forget awhile the dreadful doom of life. And Cacharoth was felled, as though lightning had smitten him. Then Beren and Luthien went through the gate, and down the labyrinthine stairs, and together wrought the greatest deed that had been dared by elves or men. For they came to the seat of Morgoth in this nethermost hall, that was upheld by horror, lit by fire, and filled with weapons of death and torment. There Beren slunk in wolf's form beneath his throne, but Luthien was stripped of her disguise by the will of Morgoth, and he bent his gaze upon her. She was not daunted by his eyes, and she named her own name, and offered her service to sing before him, after the manner of a minstrel. Then Morgoth, looking upon her beauty, conceived in his thought an evil lust, and a design more dark than any that had yet come into his heart since he fled from Valinor. Thus he was beguiled by his own malice, for he watched her, leaving her free for a while, and taking secret pleasure in his thought. Then suddenly she eluded his sight, and out of the shadows began a song of such surpassing loveliness, and of such blinding power, that he listened perforce, and a blindness came upon him, as his eyes roamed to and fro, seeking her. All his court were cast down in slumber, and all the fires faded and were quenched. But the Silmarils in the crown on Morgoth's head blazed forth suddenly with a radiance of white flame, and the burden of that crown and of the jewels bowed down his head, as though the world were set upon it, laden with the weight of care, of fear, and of desire, and even the will of Morgoth could not support. Then Luthien, catching up her winged robe, sprang into the air, and her voice came dropping down like rain into pools profound and dark. She cast her cloak before his eyes, and set upon him a dream, dark as the outer void where he once walked alone. Suddenly he fell, as a hill sliding an avalanche, and hurled, like thunder, from his throne, lay prone upon the floors of hell. The iron crown rolled echoing from his head. All things were still. As a dead beast Beren lay upon the ground, but Luthien, touching him with her hand, aroused him, and he cast aside the wolf-hame. Then he drew forth the knife Angrist, and from the iron claws that held it he cut a Silmaril. As he closed it in his hand, the radiance welled through his living flesh, and his hand became as a shining lamp, but the jewels suffered his touch and hurt him not. It came then into Berin's mind that he would go beyond his vow, and bear out of Angband all 3 of the jewels of Fëanor. But such was not the doom of the Silmarils. The knife Angrus snapped, and a shard of the blade, flying, smote the cheek of Morgoth. He groaned and stirred, and all the host of Angband moved in sleep. Then terror fell upon Beren and Luthien, and they fled, heedless and without disguise, desiring only to see the light once more. They were neither hindered nor pursued, but the gate was held against their going out, for Carcharoth had arisen from sleep, and stood now in wrath upon the threshold of Angband. Before they were aware of him, he saw them, and sprang upon them as they ran. Okay, well, I'm going to stop there. It's such a compelling story that I could easily continue. But there you go. There's a little bit of Beren and Luthien from the Silmarillion. And it's relevant to a question I'm going to answer a bit later in the video, specifically about Luthien. The one thing that I want to explain there is when they're approaching Angband, which is the fortress of Hell, where Morgoth is, it is mentioned that Carcharoth, the great wolf, the greatest of all the werewolves, sees them coming. And he thinks, that's funny, because he had gotten news that Dragluin had been killed. Dragluin was the very first werewolf that Sauron created. And Carcharoth was the greatest of them all, as mentioned, hand-fed by Morgoth with living flesh. And what they're doing is they have the original werewolf Dragluin. They have his hide around them, and they're sort of doing like a using him as a disguise. But of course, there's like, wait a minute. I know that guy's not living anymore. He's dead. He can't be approaching. There's something up about this, and it smells funky. So, and then of course Luthien puts him to sleep, and they get in anyway. And on the way out, Beren gets it in his head that if he holds up the Silmaril, it's going to repel the wolf. Of course, that doesn't work. The wolf bites his hand off and swallows it with the Silmaril. And then it was mentioned in this passage that when Beren held the Silmaril in his hand, that it suffered his touch and harmed him not, because they were hallowed by Varda. They were created by Fëanor, but they were hallowed by Varda, which means they're holy, and anything that touches them that is evil or wicked is burned with a searing hot fire. That's why Morgoth has them on a crown. His hand is already burnt up from touching them. He didn't even actually touch them. He had them in a crystal casket, but he's so evil that it was burning him through the crystal casket. So that's why he put them on the iron crown, so that he could wear them and display them, like, haha, I got your Silmarils, without actually being harmed by them. It probably still kind of gave him a headache, speaking of headaches, but it didn't burn him. And then he loses one anyway to Beren here, and then Beren loses it to Carcharoth. But imagine if you're an evil creature like a werewolf, like Carcharoth is, and then having it inside of you. And that's how the girdle of Melian that protects the elven realm of Doriath got punctured, because Carcharoth became mad with pain and rage and just started running around on a rampage. And the girdle of Melian, and I'm going to explain this a little bit later, it's not a physical barrier, so he just ran right through it, because there was no, you must turn aside, because he wasn't thinking, he's just running. So that's how that led to the fall of Doriath, among many other things. But anyway, we're gonna get to the questions, because I do have a lot to get through this week. We're playing a little bit of catch up. We have 20 questions to get through. Let's start with the first one. Our first question comes in by the request of Matthew Culbertson, who asks, do hobbits ever recolonize the Gladden Fields during the Fourth Age, where Smeagol and the Stoor hobbits lived originally? No, as far as we know, no. By the end of the Third Age, most, if not all, hobbits lived in Eriador. Almost all of them, in Arthedain specifically, located in places like Breeland, the Shire, Buckland, Westmarch. Aragorn, as king, expanded the borders of the Shire. Some would still live in places like Bree. The hobbits of the Gladden Fields were gone. One way or another, Saruman misdirected the Nazgul, who were looking for the location that hobbits dwell at, by sending them to the Vales of the Anduin, because they asked him where the hobbits lived. And by the Gladden Fields and the Vales of the Anduin. And there's two different versions of how this turned out. In one version, the Nazgul went there and everything was long abandoned. They found remnants of ancient Storish settlements, but clearly they hadn't lived there for a very long time. And in another version, there actually still were some hobbits there that still lived there, and they killed them, actually. They were slaughtered. The only reason that the hobbits lived there in the first place was that these were remigrant stores. They had, like all of the hobbits, they had migrated to Breeland and eventually founded the Shire, and they found that not to their liking. They were culturally different, and they regressed to an earlier point in their culture. They didn't like the way that the Hobbit culture was evolving, and you see it a little bit. Tolkien talks about this in great detail in one of his letters, but you see it a little bit in the way that they handle birthdays. For example, Smeagol demands the One Ring from Deagol, and when Deagol says, "Why should I give it to you?" and he says, "Because it's my birthday," and he says, "Well, I already gave you a present, and it was more than I could afford, and you're not getting a second one." So Smeagol, it's his birthday, and he wants a birthday present, and he didn't like the birthday present that he got. We never found out what it actually was, but we know that from the letter that Tolkien wrote to a fan, that he just didn't think it was an adequate gift. So they were sort of angry with each other, because Deagol's like, he makes me get these presents, and I don't have that much money, and Smeagol's like, he gives me these lousy presents, and they're not very good, and I want something better. So they're all sort of like in a bad mood already, and then the ring comes into play, and then of course that leads to murder. But when we learned about how hobbits handle their birthdays in The Lord of the Rings, it's that they give out presents, and I think it was even mentioned in The Hobbit. I'm not sure about that. I just read The Hobbit recently too, but I know it definitely comes into play in The Lord of the Rings, is that they don't get presents on their birthday. They give away presents on their birthday. And of course, Bilbo Baggins, being very wealthy and very generous for his 111st birthday, gave away a great many gifts. And because so many of the hobbits are all related to each other, and there's usually like a couple of birthdays a week, so you're down to get a couple of presents every month or so. And the presents are usually like these inexpensive sort of trinkets that the hobbits refer to as mathams, but tchotchkes would be sort of the human way of saying it. But in the case of Bilbo, he gave away really, really good presents, especially to the younger folks that he was very fond of. So, this came from Tolkien getting a letter saying, well, how come Smeagol, if he was a hobbit, he was expecting a present when hobbits don't do that. They give away presents on their birthday. And this is where he goes into the cultural differences, and, and that this is like part of why, it's not the only reason. They didn't like, oh, we're not doing this birthday thing, let's move, back to the Vales of the Anduin. There was more to it than that, but it showed that these guys were different. And it wasn't all of the stores. It was just some of them. Some of the stores, because there were still stores in Bree, and there were stores in the Shire, of course. I mean, the way that you read it, it's sort of a very surface level, or just see the film. And a lot of people make this assumption that Smeagol and Deagol were from before the Shire, but the Shire is way older. Like Smeagol and Deagol, that was, something like 600 years before the Lord of the Rings, but by that time, the Shire had been around for 1,000 years. And that doesn't mean that Smeagol himself lived in the Shire. It means that his people remigrated. Tolkien uses the word remigrant a lot. So they were a different sort. And that's the only reason they went there, is because they really didn't like being there. But most hobbits love living in Breeland, or they love living in the Shire, or they love living in Westmarch. This is their sort of place. The only hobbits we hear living elsewhere in the Fourth Age were Merry and Pippin. They lived in the Shire, of course, and they were important political figures in the Shire, but then they traveled to Rohan when they got word that Éomer was dying, and they stayed with him until he died, and then they lived out the rest of their life in Gondor, and they actually wound up being buried next to Aragorn. So, there you have it. Of course, I think they died before Aragorn did, but I know that they made sure that their caskets were on either side of him. So anyway, there you have it. Let's get on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Jessica Chan, who asks, how might the history of Middle-earth have unfolded differently if Fëanor had successfully brought the Silmarils to Valinor before Melkor stole them? So I find this to be a very curious question, because there's something in the Silmarillion that sort of hints towards this, where it says if Fëanor had agreed to surrender the Silmarils to the Valar, then a lot of things that happened later would have happened differently. It would have been better. But Fëanor would never do that under any circumstance. The Silmarillion mentions that if he'd agreed to do that, things would be different, but it's a bit of editorializing by the author, and it doesn't really actually matter, because he said no. And some of them are getting a little aggressive, like Tulkas. But here's the thing. At this point, he doesn't know that Melkor had broken into Formenos. He doesn't know that Melkor has killed his father. And he doesn't know that Melkor has taken the Silmarils. No one knew any of this, except Namo knew that Finwë was dead. Fëanor not getting the Silmarils to Valinor to revive the trees, it wasn't because Melkor had stolen them. It's because he didn't want to do this. He was actually in Valinor when this all went down, and the trees had been destroyed, and they immediately asked him about the Silmarils, and they said, "Look, we know this is a lot to ask, but would you get those gems for us, and we'll break them open and we'll revive the trees?" And the only one that was sort of like, well, give him a minute here was Aula, because I think he understood, being a craftsman himself. And Fëanor was like, oh man, those were my greatest craft. I could never create something like that ever again. And Yavanna was sort of like, well, the trees were that for me. And Tulkas was like, hey, buddy, an answer, quick, let's go. Are you really going to say no to Yavanna? And he said no. I you know what? And you know what? You could take them by force, and if you do that, I'll know you're just like him, referring to Melkor. And this, he thinks they're still sitting there in his fortress with his father guarding them. He has no idea that they're gone. So it wasn't a matter of he didn't get them there in time. It was that he wouldn't have done it anyway. He said no. And for their part, the Valar, he didn't expect this, but the Valar actually respected his wishes. They said, okay, well, it's your choice, that really, that's not great for us, but, we can force you, but we're not going to force you because we're not like him. We're not like Melkor. So anyway, there you have it. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Here's a question from Andrew Tempest, who says, in the foreword to The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien writes that the main defect is the book is too short. What did he want to add to the book to make it longer without have made it better? So The Lord of the Rings, like all of Tolkien's work, was ever evolving. It just managed to slip out of his grasp and get published, which prevented him from tinkering with it until he died. And there were still revisions. There were revisions mostly to correct little minor errors. Tolkien had a propensity for writing and rewriting and tinkering with his stories endlessly and not publishing them. Within his lifetime, he published The Hobbit in the 30s and then The Lord of the Rings in the 50s. The rest of his work in the Legendarium was published posthumously after his death in the 70s and beyond. One of his earliest stories was The Fall of Gondolin, which he started working on in 1917. And he had one completed version of The Fall of Gondolin, which you could read in the Book of Lost Tales Part 2. Last episode, I read a little bit of that. And there was a skeletal revision that exists in the Silmarillion. Even when he died in 1973, he was working on another revision of The Fall of Gondolin, which would have been a very detailed work. And you could read it the bit of it that he finished in Unfinished Tales and also in the Fall of Gondolin book. And it ends right as Tuor is arriving in Gondolin. It doesn't even really contain the titular fall. It's just the beginning of a story, but boy, is it good. Beren and Luthien, he also wrote that in 1917, and there is, of course, an abridged version in the Silmarillion. I read a little bit of that earlier. And many of the versions were collected in the book Beren and Luthien, which was published after his death. But his son had to whittle down over 1,000 pages of drafts to choose what to include in the Beren and Luthien book. In the 50s, he wanted to publish The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion together as one work, which he called at the time the Saga of the Three Jewels and the Rings of Power. His publisher was not so interested in this. They wanted a sequel to The Hobbit. They didn't want the deep lore. But the fact is, he had a more or less finished saga at that point in the 1950s. Now, he realized that it wasn't going to be published as is. He focused on just The Lord of the Rings, and then later he just continually revised the Silmarillion, hoping that one day he would get to publish it. And I knew he knew it wasn't going to get published until after he died. The Lord of the Rings wasn't even a big hit until the 60s. And at that point, he was deep in revising his work endlessly. Even as he died in the 70s, he had another outline for a complete overhaul of his lore, and he lamented the fact that he could not greatly expand The Lord of the Rings. He found that the appendices were too short, and it was unsatisfying. However, if Tolkien was given endless time to finish it, he never would have finished it. And he acknowledged this in a story that he wrote called Leaf by Niggle. However, as to what he would have added, I can't say for certain all the things he would have changed or added or even omitted, but the one thing I'm sure of is that in the appendices there's a story called The Tale of Aragorn and Arwen. I think that would have been fully integrated into the book. And it's also possible that the quest for Erebor, which is found in Unfinished Tales, would probably have been part of The Return of the King. Other than that, I can't be sure. He probably would have had a lot more appendices as well. Okay, let's get on to the next question. This next question comes in from Banazir, who says, In the Ainur Lindale says about the Valar, they were Arda's life and it was theirs. Is this like a benevolent version of Melkor marring or pouring himself into the world? If yes, how was the world changed when Tulkas came and did the same later? So I would say that your observation is astute, but it's underselling a little bit what Melkor did. All of the Ainur put themselves into the world. But there was a time and a place for this, and it was during the music. Even at this point, Melkor was already overstepping his bounds. Ilúvatar led them in themes, but it was the Ainur that made the music. Essentially, they were supposed to improvise their tunes based off of the lead that Ilúvatar gave them. What Melkor did was he sang a completely different tune, discordant themes, and it was not based in any way upon Ilúvatar's lead. He was attempting to wrest control of the music from God himself. I'm going to read you the relevant passage from the Silmarillion. But when they were come into the void, Ilúvatar said to them, Behold your music. And he showed them a vision, given to them sight, where before was only hearing, and they saw a new world made visible before them, and it was globed amid the void, and it was sustained therein, but was not of it. And as they looked and wondered, this world began to unfold its history, and it seemed to them that it lived and grew. And when the Ainur had gazed for a while and were silent, Ilúvatar said again, Behold your music. This is your minstrelsy, and each of you shall find contained herein, amid the design that I set before you, all those things which it may seem that he himself devised or added. And thou, Melkor, wilt discover all the secret thoughts of thy mind, and wilt perceive that they are but a part of the whole, and tributary to its glory. So this paragraph is often pointed out for one specific part. They are but a part of the whole and tributary to its glory, which is going off the earlier example, none may alter the music in my despite. That Melkor, his efforts are futile. He is incapable of defiling the music no matter what. However, I like to point out to you one other aspect of this quote, and that is, "And thou, Melkor, will discover all the secret thoughts of thy mind." This tells us that while every single Ainu's thoughts are found in the world, Ilúvatar elected to use all of Melkor's thoughts. Everybody got to pitch ideas, and everybody had at least one idea included in the final project, but it was still mostly Melkor. This was to prove a point. Even in giving him this amount of control, he's still not the boss. He's not the one in control. He still can only carry out the will of God. We see this imbalance in the wars of the Valar, where it was 14 of the powers all united against one, Melkor, and all of them put their power into the world, but Melkor was weakened by spending himself on himself. That's the way that Huron put it. In putting so much of himself into the world, he didn't have a lot left for his own self, and he wound up a shadow of what he was, a cowardly incarnate, in the end being kicked around by Eonwa, and then kicked off of the group project. But with so much of his mess left behind, including his star student, Sauron, that they'll be dealing with him for a long time still, until the end of the world, as a matter of fact. Tulkas entering the world at a later date, it's a bit of a contentious claim. I want to talk about Tulkas a little bit here. The Quenta Silmarillion says that he was in the far heaven, and that he heard of the tumult of Melkor, and he came to aid the Valar. The far heaven is not exactly the same thing as the void, or the timeless halls. And some have interpreted this wording that all of the Valar had entered Ea, that's the universe, at the same time, but Tulkas chose to wander the skies, not descend directly to Arda until he was needed. And I think that this is a valid interpretation to me, as he explicitly was not sent to respond to Melkor, but he saw that he was needed, and he took it upon himself to come down to the planet. So personally, I agree. Tulkas entered the universe at the same time as all the others. He just didn't go directly to the planet. This accounts for the fact that in the entire history of the world, no other Ainur was sent down or chosen to come from the outside. Okay, next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Brad Dickerson, who asks, "How did the dwarves get so much mithril to Erebor to make Bilbo's shirt?" Well, Moria was the only source of mithril in Middle-earth, but that doesn't mean that all the mithril was in Moria. Moria was established in the First Age, and it survived until the Balrog took over in the Third Age. During this time, a lot of the mithril that was found there wound up being carted all over the place. It was mined for a long time, and it found its way all over Middle-earth. This would also be added to by any mithril that might have been brought from Númenor before its destruction. The dwarves weren't the only ones who worked with mithril. They traded a lot of it to the elves. Narya, for example, was made out of mithril, and the elves even created an alloy out of the mithril called Ithildin, which is what Narvi, the dwarf, wound up using to create the words on the doors of Durin. Even after the Balrog took over, a lot of the mithril was still carted out of Moria, because the orcs, they wouldn't mine for it, but they carried what they found out, and they gave it to Sauron. So while mithril was pretty rare by Bilbo's time, and worth so much that this mithril chain shirt was worth as much as the Shire and everything in it, at least according to Gandalf, it's not as if there wasn't enough mithril that it would have been so rare that they couldn't have made the shirt. It was rare and it was valuable, but it was not impossible to obtain. Okay, next question. So this next question is related to, we talked about Tulkas earlier, and it came in from Banazir. Had Melkor chosen not to rebel, would Tulkas still have entered the world, or was he meant as a sort of replacement for Melkor? So we talked about this earlier. Tulkas was already in the world with a capital W. He just wasn't hanging around on the planet Arda. The Silmarillion does not state that Tulkas was sent summoned or otherwise designated to come at that particular time, it says that he noticed from far heaven, which is not capitalized, what Melkor was up to, and he decided to intervene. Now, the lack of capitalization is important. He said the far heaven, not the void, where it's capitalized. The timeless halls is capitalized. Outside is capitalized. When he refers to what is outside the created world, Ea. The Ainur all came to Ea at the same time. At least that's what I believe based on this particular analysis of the text. It's just that Tulkas decided to float around instead of going right to Arda. He came because he saw a fight was brewing, and he wanted in on that fight. He stayed because he fell in love with Nessa. So there you have it. Okay, next question. Our next question comes in from Miguel, who asks, why did Morgoth and the Balrogs become incarnates while Sauron did not? Very different circumstances. While it's never explicitly mentioned why the Balrogs became incarnate, we know that the Valar can incarnate the Maiar, as seen with the Astari, the wizards. Thus, it's reasonably safe to surmise that it was probably Melkor who incarnated the Balrogs. He wanted them in that particular form. Melkor himself incarnated accidentally, meaning that he did not make a conscious choice to incarnate himself, but rather through a great expanding and spreading out of his own power, he became stuck in his Dark Lord form, unable to take on another. Sauron was more useful to Melkor as a shapeshifter. His function was more managerial than the Balrogs. He was the spy, the torturer, the sorcerer, the general. Sauron expanded a great deal of his power as well into the One Ring later on. But in doing this, he kept it in rapport with himself. It was centralized, and it wasn't too spread out. It didn't weaken him. Even to be separated from the ring, he lost the extra powers that the ring gave him, but it did not make him too much weaker. According to Tolkien's letters, at least, when they were separated. That's why it was the ring's destruction that weakened him, not just merely being separated from it. Okay, next question. Our next question is also from Miguel, and it almost seems like a follow-up question, although they were submitted at the same time. When an Ainur becomes incarnated, does that mean their body has to die before they can return to their spirit form, or can they choose to abandon it if they want to? Good question. Very good question. They absolutely cannot abandon their bodies voluntarily. Incarnated means bound to flesh. The important bit here is bound. They're stuck like that. They're trapped in these bodies. They do seem to be exceptions for certain incarnates. Mainly the elves had the ability to abandon their bodies, but this extraordinary ability was very sparingly used, or, well, I should say it was said that they could use this in the most extreme circumstances, and we never actually got an example of an elf doing this. Like Mithril, for example, did not abandon her body. She died of exhaustion and then refused to reincarnate for a long time. The ability of elves to throw off their horar was mentioned specifically by Tolkien as a trauma response when asked what would happen if somebody tried to do certain things to an elf that I'm not allowed to talk about on YouTube. While Tolkien did not avoid the topic that I'm alluding to entirely, it's in The Children of Húrin, for example, he seemed to me to be avoiding people imagining that sort of thing happening to elves. He claimed that the elves can do this and that we should take that as a fact, but it's something that seems exclusive to elves, not Incarnate Ainur. So in the instance of characters like Gandalf, does he have to die of old age? Which is possible because Narnia loses its power after the One Ring's destruction, so he's going to start aging like Saruman had aged. It would still take a really long time, though, to cast aside his body and be either a naked spirit or to take on a fauna of his choice. I would say no. Due to the fact that he was incarnated by the Valar, so it stands to reason that they could probably reverse the process. That's my interpretation of it anyway. Good question. Okay, let's go on to the next one. This next question also happens to come in from Miguel. I promise you that I don't play favorites. I just pick questions. I don't look at who wrote them when I'm doing these videos, and then I look at who wrote the question like pretty much right before I record the segment. So it's like, oh, look at that, 3 in a row. Why did the Valar seemingly abandon Middle-earth for most of the First Age and not send a host to defeat Morgoth until the arrival of Eärendil? Because they had already done a great deal of damage to Middle-earth. When they arrived in Arda, the Valar fought a war against Melkor, a battle over the control of Middle-earth. The Valar won. Once Tulkas came down from the far heaven, we talked about that already, and he tipped the scales in their favor. The spring of Arda began, but the war was picked up again once Tulkas slumbered, and the Valar and Melkor went at it again. So I'm going to show some pictures. It turned Middle-earth from this into something more like this. Yeah, that's very different, isn't it? That's a very destructive war. Even sending over envoys in the First Age wound up being extremely destructive. The entire region of Beleriand was destroyed by the War of Wrath. The Valar being in Middle-earth and taking a direct hand in dealing with Melkor, that's a bit too nuclear. And even sending Eänwa was an extremely destructive move. So they were trying to scale back their involvement because they didn't want to do more damage to the world. Okay, next question. I just went to do this next one, and yeah, 4 in a row. It's Miguel again. Would Sauron's plan to dominate the elves with the rings have succeeded if Celebrimbor hadn't made the 3 rings? No, the elves were just too perceptive. And in my opinion, Sauron played his hand too quickly. When Sauron made the 1, he became aware of these extra 3 rings, but their properties were protecting against time and decay and evil in general. They did not have any particular ability to detect the One Ring. The elves all detected Sauron, not just the bearers of the 3, because as a matter of fact, the bearers of the 3, they didn't even have their rings yet. It was after the 1 was created and the elves realized that they had been deceived that Celebrimbor went to seek the counsel of Galadriel in Lothlorien. And he left one of the rings with her before he traveled to Lindon and gave the other 2 to Gil-galad, who gave one of them to Círdan. They did not wear or use these rings until the Third Age, when they believed that Sauron was gone forever and the One Ring was lost. If Sauron had waited another 100 years or so, I mean, he waited less than a century, and that's not a long time for elves, and he just let them become accustomed to their rings and perhaps enamored with the power of the rings, he may have had more success, but he was impatient. Okay, next question. And this one's an anonymous one, so not another one from the same person 5 times in a row. So it's just, I need that killer instinct sound there. How many elves were present at Helm's Deep, and how did they end up there I'm having a hard time reading this. How many elves were present at Helm's Deep, and how did they end up there if they had all left for the west? Okay, there was exactly 1 elf at Helm's Deep. Legolas was the only elf present at the Battle of Helm's Deep in the 2 towers. No other elves were there. They obviously had not sailed to the west either. Some had, of course, but many elves still remained in Middle-earth in places like Rivendell and Lothlorien and Mirkwood. The films, they changed things up a bit. Haldir showed up with a contingent of elves to battle at Helm's Deep, somehow claiming to be bearing a message from Elrond. I didn't mind the elves being there in the movie, though it didn't make much sense that they got so easily killed. Either way, there was no reason to believe that these guys had left Middle-earth. The Fellowship had already met Haldir in Lothlorien, not to mention Elrond, Arwen, Galadriel, Celeborn, Elladan, Elrohir, Glorfindel, Galdor, Erestor, and Gildor and Glorian, and a whole host of other unnamed elves. So there were still plenty of elves left. Okay, next question. I'm smiling again. Here's a question that came in from Ian Snow. I really like this one. What the heck did Galadriel see in Celeborn? I wondered this myself. When elves fall in love, they just do. And it hits them hard, and it hits them fast. One of the biggest examples we get of this sort of thing was between Iluthingel and Melian. Now, she's not an elf, but this is an example of how it works. They saw each other, and they were instantly smitten. And as soon as they touched hands, they were transfixed, and they could not move for literal years. This sort of thing isn't typical. They normally don't stand gazing into each other's eyes for years. But love does hit them like a sack of wet mice. Tolkien even stated that an elf can tell if another elf is married just by looking at their face. As for what she actually saw specifically in Celeborn, who knows? He doesn't come off very well in The Lord of the Rings. The claims that he is the wisest elf only seems kind of silly when all he basically does is say that Gandalf should have known better. Of course, he was going to die. He kind of went into a bad neighborhood like Moria, not because it was a Balrog, but because it was a dwarf land. Celeborn's distrust of dwarves makes a little bit more sense, but you realize he was in Doriath when some dwarves murdered Iluthingel. But then again, if he's so wise, he should maybe realize hashtag not all dwarves. We also learned that he separated from Galadriel for an extended period of time when she wished to travel through dwarven lands, and he did not. Now, Tolkien uses this as an example of how elvish couples could spend years apart, and it doesn't really affect their marriage. It doesn't really affect their relationship. They're just fine because they're immortal. What's a couple of decades apart? But it just comes off as Celeborn is racist. He doesn't want to go where the dwarves are. Unfinished Tales gives us a little bit more insight into Celeborn and the fact that both he and Galadriel are basically unfinished characters. His part in the Silmarillion is small, and her part's small. His part is minuscule, actually. And Tolkien did not intend that. He wished to fully expand both characters and make them very fleshed out characters that would have big parts in the Silmarillion, but he had all these different ideas of how they met, where they met, who is Celeborn even? Was he a Sindar elf from Doriath, or was he a Telerin prince from Valinor? Either way, whatever she saw in him would have been through her own lens, not through that of the Fellowship, because when we're reading about what happened in Lothlorien, and this is our main way of getting to know Celeborn as a person, it's sort of through Frodo's eyes, not through Galadriel's eyes. So we don't know what he's like when they're alone together. You know, he could be very charming for all we know. That's it. Love is love, right? I'll move on to the next one. What are some possible explanations for Tolkien's decision not to include a scene where Frodo explains the ring's fate to Bilbo? Because Bilbo would have basically forgotten about a few minutes later. Bilbo at one point was quite aware of Frodo's quest. He even had volunteered himself for the task before being told, hey, man, sit down, you're too old to do this sort of thing. Bilbo, at this point, when he volunteered, he was 128 years old, though due to having the One Ring, for 60 of those years, he appears much younger. This only affects his appearance, though. He still felt every bit of his years. Bilbo explained to Gandalf when he was 111 that he felt thin and stretched, like a very little bit of butter scraped over a lot of bread. While he did feel better as soon as he gave up the ring, there was no doubting that he was still a super centenarian. At the age of 129, when he spoke to Frodo after the destruction of the One Ring, he asked about it, and Frodo just told him that he got rid of it. And Bilbo was like, oh, right, that was the whole point. That's why you did this. It was to get rid of it. He doesn't ask about the ring again at the age of 131 when they sail to the west together, though it is possible at this point that he might have forgotten about the One Ring completely. Bilbo's memory was failing, and saddling him with additional details and stressing him out with the horrific particulars of Frodo's quest would have been unwarranted, as he likely would not have remembered it anyway. Bilbo was very old, but he was also happy. And there was no reason to upset him, especially as he had blamed himself for the entire ordeal to begin with. Next question. And our thumbnail question comes in from Jessica Chan, who asks, what are the Entwives, and why did Tolkien remove all references to them from his later writings about Middle-earth? So Entwives are married female Ents. Tolkien did not remove references to them. Entwives were the lady Ents who were married, and the ones that were not were referred to as Ent maidens. The only character that mentioned them was Treebeard. He tells Merry and Pippin that he lost them sometime during the Second Age. Treebeard is being literal. He doesn't know where they are. He doesn't know what happened to them. They traveled somewhere and then they never came back. Ents are a very small part of the Silmarillion. Their creation is covered, and a group of them assists Beren at one point. There are no named Ent characters in the Silmarillion or any of its satellite stories other than The Lord of the Rings. Like many of the things that were created specifically for The Lord of the Rings, he had to retroactively add them to the Silmarillion. Remember, the Silmarillion, he started writing that first. And they didn't get a lot of attention, like Galadriel and Celeborn. We mentioned that just now. Tolkien didn't remove references to the Entwives. He merely just only mentioned them once, and it was in The Lord of the Rings. In private correspondence, he pretty much refused to answer the open question of their fate, stating that he didn't know what happened to them, though he feared they may have died during the War of the Last Alliance. This is an author's guess. It's not a definitive answer. Tolkien absolutely intended for his fans to speculate and to use their imaginations about what happened to the Entwives. Galadriel certainly thought at some point that they would be restored along with the world itself, as when asked by Treebeard when he could see her and Celeborn again, Celeborn stated, I don't know, and Galadriel said, we'll meet again in Beleriand, which was a land that was long since destroyed. She doesn't specifically say Beleriand. She mentions a specific part of Beleriand. This tells me that the Ents will be included in Arda Unmarred after the second music, and it's likely that in this world that will be recreated without evil, that the Entwives and the Ent Maidens will be around again. Okay, next question. How did Ar-Pharazon's reliance on Sauron ultimately lead to Númenor's downfall? So the thing about that is that Númenor was already on a steady course for downfall before Sauron showed up. He hastened it, though. While Sauron certainly brought Númenor to ruin by convincing them that they should worship Melkor and that he himself was Melkor incarnate, they were already a fallen people. If Númenor were still the good guys at this point, and not just outliers like Elendil, then the king never would have let Sauron out of prison and made him his advisor and allowed human sacrifices. As a matter of fact, Pharazon shouldn't have even been the king at all. Pharazon took the throne by forcing the rightful heir, Tarmiriel, to marry him. By cutting Tarmiriel out and taking the Ar prefix rather than Tar, he was declaring Númenor as a whole to no longer be a land of the faithful. They were already quite on the road to ruin, which is something that Sauron exploited. Okay, next question. Here's a question from Hybrid Spectre, who asks, do the Shadow of Mordor games fit in the Lord of the Rings story? So full disclosure here, I do have these games, Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor and Middle-earth Shadow of War. I haven't actually played them. I've been waiting for an opportunity to do it live on Twitch. Though I will do it, but I haven't yet. So just full disclosure, I haven't actually played them. But I am aware of the stories in sort of a broad stroke sense and certain details about it. And I know enough about these games to say no, they don't fit in with The Lord of the Rings at all. They fit in with The Lord of the Rings about as well as a pineapple would fit through the eye of a needle. Elves can't be wraiths. That right there, that just sort of invalidates a large portion of the plot of Shadow of Mordor. Shelob certainly did not have a humanoid form, and the revealed identities of the Nazgul, they don't exactly fit in with the timeline. The 9 Nazgul were fully formed and out there before Helm Hammerhand was ever born, so he couldn't be a Nazgul. And not only that, but he died. He straight up died. The Nazgul are undead in the sense that they should have died a long time ago, and they're kept alive because of necromancy, because of the rings and the way that they're bound to Sauron. But Helm, he just died. Now, of course, canon, we talked about this in the last episode, canon is a dubious idea at best when you talk about Tolkien. His ideas were ever-changing and ever-evolving. He was not above changing things outright, and he would have fully rewritten The Hobbit at one point if his friend Simone de Beauvoir had not convinced him to abandon that thought. The Silmarillion is cobbled together from heaps of unfinished scraps, and he was always revising things. We talked about that earlier as well. At the time of his death, he had the idea, and it's an outline that you can read in the book Morgoth's Ring in a section called Myths Transformed. He had this idea that the Silmarillion itself was not canon. It was just a story told by the elves, and that the truth was far stranger. Like, one example, Angband was on the moon. So while things like the Shadow of games certainly contradict the established books on many, many, many accounts, that should absolutely not stop you from enjoying them from what they are. Just think of them as stories that are told in Gondor. The events may have more or less happened in a sort of broad strokes way, but just not specifically like that, not the way that they're told. Okay, next question. Here's a question from Link of Wise, who asks, why did the Rings of Power not work on dwarves? Would they have not become wraiths if they kept them for too long, or were they just completely immune? They weren't really immune. The rings did affect them. They just didn't affect them in the way that Sauron was hoping. The rings did not cause the dwarves to fall under Sauron's control. Tolkien described it, the dwarves are too strong for Sauron's control. I would say that maybe a better way to understand it is to say they're too different. The dwarves were affected by those rings. They became greedier, they became reckless, and this contributed to the downfall of their society in Moria, but they did not become Sauron's puppets. It's important to remember that the Rings of Power were not made for dwarves, or men, or hobbits. They were made for elves. All of them, except for the One Ring, were made by elves, and they were made for elves. The issue was that Sauron played his hand too quickly. I mentioned this earlier. He made the One Ring less than a century, which is a very small amount of time to elves after they had created their rings, and he didn't let them become used to them and sort of fall in love with their rings. They sensed him when he made the one. They perceived what he had done, and they abjured their rings. Sauron took the rings back by force, and he gave them to men, and he gave them to dwarves, except for the three that Celebrimbor had managed to get out of Eregion and hide, one in Lothlorien, two in Lindon. It was a success with men. Men are essentially the same species as elves. There's no physiological difference between the two, just a spiritual one. Elves are immortal, men are not. Men, however, are less perceptive to magic than elves. And furthermore, he handpicked men that were already evil. They were either his followers, or they were wicked kings and tyrants that would not think twice about the cost of such power. Dwarves, though, they're not like elves. They're not like men. They're not children of Iluvatar, created in the third theme of the Ainur Lindala. They were constructs that were made by the Vala Aula and then approved of by Iluvatar, who gave them free will. This makes the dwarves just too different from elves for such magic to work properly on them. Okay, next question. Here's a question that comes from Nathaniel Woods, who asks, although Elrond is commonly regarded and identified as being wise, would Tolkien have considered Elros to be wiser, at least in regards to their long-term fates, for his choice of mortality as a human over immortality of the elves? Interesting question. I don't think that choosing mortality over immortality or choosing immortality over mortality was seen as a wise choice long-term. To get some insight into the thought process, we can examine the choices that the twins' parents made, Eärendil and Elwing. They were both mortal Perithil. That's the way they were born. Perithil means half-elf, and they were mortal. Because Eärendil's father was a mortal man, at least at the time of his birth, Tur, and his mother was an immortal elf named Idril, while Elwing was the daughter of Dior, who was mortal, and I know some people want to argue this point, but according to Christopher Tolkien, He was mortal, and if we don't believe Christopher, then, who are we going to believe, really? Of course, the immortal mother there was Nimloth. So Eärendil and Elwing both had a complicated ancestry there. Eärendil's father being the only mortal man to become immortal, though he was born before this happened. And Elwing's mother was the only immortal to ever become mortal. So Tur and Luthien are sort of two unique cases, both changing their doom by special grace of Iluvatar, that's God himself, just going in opposite directions. So when given a choice, Elwing chose immortality. Eärendil had it in his heart that he wished to be mortal, but he chose love over his own wishes. He didn't ever want to be sundered from his wife Elwing, so he became immortal with her. In applying this to the twins, we are not told their reasoning for making the choices that they made. Both wound up incredibly important characters. They had very big roles. And I would say that neither made the wiser choice. It is my belief that the choices echoed that of their parents. Elrond chose what was in his heart, while Elros, well, we don't know why he chose mortality. Nor do we know the name of his wife, or the date at which he met her. But it is very possible that he, like his father, may have chosen mortality out of love. And we would see this choice echoed down to his niece Arwen, who chose mortality out of love. In Tolkien's world, the few Perithal who are given a choice don't often explain why. Eärendil explained why. Arwen explained why. They're the only ones that we get an explicit reasoning behind their choices, and they both chose for the same reason, which is love. So it stands to reason that every other one who made a choice did so out of emotion rather than wisdom. That is my opinion. Okay, next question. So here's a question that comes in from Eric Vargas, who asks, why did Gandalf allow Frodo to decide which path to take in the Fellowship of the Ring? Isn't Frodo too sheltered to make an informed decision? So assuming that we're talking about, do we go south through the Gap of Rohan, or do we go through Moria? And I think that's what you're talking about. I would have to say Gandalf did not leave it up to Frodo. That's not how it happened at all. After they tried to go over the pass of Carathras, and that failed. The idea of using the Gap of Rohan was still there, but it was sort of shot down. Gandalf did not like that idea. He had the idea to go through Moria. Gimli agreed with it, but Aragorn was like, no, I'm against this. He had been to Moria, and he said that it was an evil place, and he would not wish to go again. Pippin and Sam agreed with Aragorn, saying they didn't want to go at all. Gandalf said, of course, no one actually wants to go into Moria, but if I lead you, will you follow me? So Aragorn was like, yeah, okay, I would go with you. And Gimli didn't need convincing. Boromir, though, he was dead set against it. He said that he would not go into Moria unless he was outvoted 8-1. And he sort of appeals to Frodo and to Legolas to agree with him. And Legolas is like, yes, no, I agree with Boromir. And Frodo says that while he does agree with Boromir, he also doesn't want to ignore Gandalf's wisdom, and he suggests that they not take a vote right away, that they should all sleep on it. They didn't have the opportunity to sleep on it because they soon realized that the howling wind that Frodo remarked on was actually wargs, and they were in danger. So Gandalf said that this proves a point. Would any of them still wish to use the Gap of Rohan with wargs hunting them? At this point, even Boromir agreed to go through Moria. The voting that they planned to have in the morning suddenly just became unanimous. So it wasn't really left up to Frodo, because Frodo didn't even make a decision. He just said, hey, let's sleep on it and then vote. But they didn't get to do that. And now we're going to go on to our last question. Our final question comes in from Stefan Ritter, who asks, when did Saruman betray his original purpose? When did he join Sauron? So these are two different questions with two different answers. So let's tackle them separately. The first question is, when did Saruman betray his original purpose? The fact is, we don't have like an exact time or an exact date. It didn't happen all at once. Upon arriving in Middle-earth, Saruman first followed the Blue Wizards that had come before him. He went to the lands to the south, and to the east that were already conquered by Sauron. As Saruman and Morenatar were sort of the original two wizards, they were the volunteers. And Morenatar wanted to take his friend Ramastana with him, that's the two blue wizards. It seemed natural that these first three would all have the same idea. Gandalf and Radagast were sort of foisted upon them by the request of Manwë and Yavanna, respectively. While the blue wizards never returned from behind enemy lines, Saruman did, and he busied himself with the White Council and establishing himself in Orthanc and studying the devices of the enemy. Saruman's fall from his original purpose was due to several key factors, and it didn't happen all at once. Saruman studying the devices of the enemy was already a defeat of his own purpose. He was there to lead people, but he was never at all interested in people. He was more interested in things. By focusing on magic and technology, he was not an effective leader, and it led him down a path that was not all that dissimilar from the likes of Fëanor and Sauron himself. Saruman discovered through unknown means that Gandalf the Grey, who he thought of as inferior, possessed Narya, the Red Ring. He was quite jealous of this fact, and also the fact that Gandalf was much beloved by the peoples of Middle-earth, while Saruman was respected. He wasn't loved. And then expanding on that, he wanted to outdo Gandalf. He coveted the One Ring to prove that he was greater. His finding and disposing of Isildur's remains, I would say, was one of his darkest deeds. Saruman became afraid of Sauron, most notably when he accidentally contacted him via the Orthanc Palantir. This fear led Saruman to believe that Sauron could not be defeated. Saruman treated the White Council as his underlings. He made assumptions about their character. He assumed that all of the other members had their own secret agendas that they were working towards, while he worked towards his own. He did not understand the concept of cooperation. He preferred to either work alone or to have people work under him. Saruman had a poor personality, and it led to him believing that only he could save Middle-earth. This is not that different from Sauron himself, and in taking up that sort of thought, he became a pale shadow of Sauron. The second question is, when did he join Sauron? That's an easier one. He didn't. Saruman never joined Sauron. Sauron would not want him. He wouldn't allow such a thing. He did contact him and pretended to join him. Saruman was trying to trick the Dark Lord into trusting him so that he could overthrow him and usurp him. And now that doesn't mean that he planned on becoming a Dark Lord himself, at least not at this point. He started with good intentions, but he took the wrong means, once again similar to Sauron himself. Sauron was not fooled. He was aware of the deception from the moment that Saruman spoke it out loud. Saruman is an excellent liar and a trickster, but to quote a TV show, comparing Sauron to Saruman, it's like the Yankees and Little League. Sauron allowed Saruman to believe he was fooled because Sauron thought two things. Firstly, that Saruman might find the One Ring, or the halfling that carries it, and thus he could regain it that way. Or Saruman could jam up Rohan in a war to prevent them from assisting Gondor. Saruman failed at both these tasks, so he wasn't useful to Sauron. He was never going to be allowed to go to Mordor and to join, Sauron. That was never going to happen, because Sauron knew that he was full of it, and that he was working his own end. So they were both basically trying to manipulate each other. Sauron was just a lot better at it. He had been manipulating for a very, very long time before Saruman tried it. Anyway, that's all our questions for the week. I really, really enjoyed doing this. I have to tell you that I was in a terrible mood earlier. I mentioned a little while ago that I had to get my internet fixed, and I was unsure of how that was going to all work out, and it turned out really good. So, that's all fixed up. And through the stream I had done a little while ago, and through recording this video, I'm just in a way better mood than I was before. I really, really enjoyed doing these videos for you guys. So keep sending me some questions, keep leaving me comments, like the video, subscribe if you haven't already. We're just barreling towards 2K here, so that's just absolutely amazing. It just keeps going faster and faster, which I absolutely love to see. I love to see your comments, I love to see your questions, and I will see you guys next time.